So a brief introduction into this session. It's the second in our two-part series. So the first was around delivery models and monitoring. This session looks at funding, research and networks as well. We're working in partnership with the Access to Justice Foundation, who were really keen to highlight this element of their beneficiaries' work. And we from the network side really saw the potential in some of our broader members as well coming into this conversation and showcasing the work that they're doing in this area. And we've been really overwhelmed by the response from the community, and it's made us clear to us that there's a huge amount of expertise and experience already existing on this topic. And so these sessions are really just a way to highlight that to everyone interested in this topic by way of bringing everyone up to speed. As part of our follow-up work, we will be collating and sharing even more examples of best practice and funding and research to move us all forward in this area. So that's it from me. For now, I'm going to hand over to Stacey Lamb to introduce the first session.
Thanks, Martha. Hi, everyone. For those of you that I haven't met, I'm Grants Director at the Access to Justice Foundation. It's lovely to see you all. So first session today, what are funders doing in this area and what does working with communities mean to them? So before I hand over to our first speaker, just from the Foundation's perspective, working with communities is just key to what we do. It's key to the advice organisations that we work with and those that we aim to help. So through working with communities and community organisations, we can reach the groups that may not otherwise access legal advice, or if so, would do so much later. And that early intervention and awareness of local advice provision means effective referrals, reducing service hopping and more efficient delivery of advice, and often avoidance of escalation and cluster issues, which then means more resources from advice organisations. So really working with communities helps identify legal issues earlier, gets people the support they need earlier, and in turn cuts down the resources for advice and savings to court time and costs. So, and just very briefly, in terms of what we're doing at the Foundation, through the Community Justice Fund, we do support community groups. And these are either issue-based groups that are able to provide some legal advice in a very specific specialist area, or organisations that support a particular group in the community where they have that trust and can support legal needs, but also the wider needs of that person. Also with our mental health working group, we are looking at ways to interact more with the community, and also we're doing some work around how we try to incorporate the user voice more in our processes. But I'll leave it there, but I'm very happy to tell you more at another point. Please do email me if you want to hear any more. But for now, I'll hand over to Lizzie Mahoney from the Greater London Authority.
Thanks, Stacey, and thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be here and to see some familiar faces too. So for those of you who I don't know, my name's Lizzie Mahoney and I'm a Senior Policy Officer working on financial hardship in the Greater London Authority. So that's the regional government body that's headed up by the Mayor of London. And I'm here to talk about a grant programme that we're funding that supports local partnerships to deliver advice in community settings. In a nutshell, so we're currently funding 11 partnerships across different areas of London to provide advice to people who would normally be less likely to access advice, and the advice is provided in places in the community where people already go. The context to this work is that in the wake of the COVID pandemic, the Mayor has launched the London Recovery Programme, which is a partnership programme that works between the Mayor, the GLA, local authorities, businesses, voluntary and community sector and so on to drive the city's social and economic recovery after the pandemic. And the programme has a number of objectives in terms of what recovery means. And one of them is to ensure that by 2025, we want to ensure that all Londoners have access to advice and support to prevent financial hardship. And one of the ways that we've been looking to reach this goal is through funding advice in community settings. So our team at the GLA has been long aware, as you all are, of the massive benefits of community advice programmes, and that there's been loads of good practice and innovation in London and elsewhere, but the funding for this type of work has been difficult to secure. But nevertheless, it's been really clear that delivering advice in local places like schools, food banks, children's centres is a really fantastic way of breaking down some of the barriers that prevent people from accessing advice. And you'll all be well versed in the benefits of this type of work, but we think that it does that in three main ways. So firstly, it increases the visibility of advice and helps people become aware that they can get advice, that services that can support them do exist, and that can help them with a problem. Secondly, it removes the barrier of having to physically go somewhere else, of course, that might have a waiting list or only be open certain times or times of day. And it makes, thirdly, accessing advice more informal and more comfortable if it's in a setting where the person receiving advice already feels supported and understood. So if people in the service speak their language, or if it's a children's centre where their children are being cared for. And we know all of this insight because we ran a pilot programme in 2019 with the Child Poverty Action Group, which looked at embedding advice in primary schools to deliver advice to parents at the school gate. And that pilot achieved amazing outcomes for families. So for every £1 we spent on advisors, families recouped £3 in additional income. And based on that pilot programme and the success of it, we decided to scale up this work, and we're funding 11 partnerships to deliver this advice in community settings. So not just in schools now, but also in emergency food settings, children's centres, community centres, and so on. We chose the partnerships based on local need. So looking at the amount of advice provision that was already in the area, the kind of extent to which it's an advice desert, and the ability of the organisation that we're funding to reach client groups of Londoners who are from demographics who would be less likely to be served by advice provision that currently exists. So Londoners from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, young Londoners, disabled Londoners, and Londoners who don't have English as a first language. So in our minds, the purpose of that funding is basically twofold. So firstly, it's to deliver outcomes for people in the here and now to maximise their incomes. So that might be through debt advice, welfare advice, or other types of advice that ultimately prevent financial hardship, like immigration advice or employment advice, if that gets you on the road to maximising your income. And then secondly, the purpose is to demonstrate the value of doing work like this to secure long-term financial sustainable funding for work like this. And we're working to procure at the moment an evaluation partner who will work with the partnerships to really demonstrate the outcomes that are achieved for people through this work. I'm conscious I don't have much time, so I'll probably wrap up there. But if you would like to hear more about the partnerships themselves, or anything else about why we're funding this and what we're doing with the evaluation, then please do contact me. I will put my details in the chat. And I will probably wrap up there because I know time is ticking. But Sioned, I think I'm passing over to you. So yeah, over to you now. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Oh God, that spotlight is quite scary, actually. Hi, I'm Sioned. I'm Director of Grants at Trust for London. And thank you for inviting me. I'm a bit of a last minute addition because I hadn't responded, so sorry about that. So the Trust is a grant maker. We fund work to tackle poverty and inequality in London, and we do fund an awful lot of advice work. I think some of my colleagues are going to be chatting later at the meeting about some of the work we're funding. But today I just wanted to probably showcase one kind of aspect of the advice that we're funding, which is around immigration advice. And it's as part of a citizenship and integration initiative. So we're working closely with the GLA and other funders. And in particular, the schools pilot project is one where we're combining kind of organising activity alongside immigration advice in a primary school setting. So this was a pilot that started in 2018, and it's led by Citizens UK in partnership with the legal expertise of Coram Children's Legal Centre. And it started out in 2 primary schools. And the idea was to kind of support the parents in that school to raise the profile of many families who have insecure status. I think some schools are aware of this, others perhaps less aware of it, but also have little kind of capacity or knowledge to do anything about it. So the idea of organising the parents to create a safe space for families who have got insecure status perhaps to come forward, and we know that schools, primary schools particularly, are kind of based on trust in school, to combine that with when families do come forward, being able to access that legal advice in an early setting. So the project started in 2 schools, in Southwark and Lewisham. And even though the pandemic kind of slowed things down, it's had a really good impact, not least on parents coming together and really campaigning locally to make sure that local authorities, no recourse to public fund teams, are kind of more responsive to them and getting their voices heard, but also for families to come forward to get the legal advice that they need. So it's been an incredibly transformative project. We've now expanded that with the next phase, where we're going to 6 more schools. I think one of the key things in the learning so far is the fact that it does rely on a good family school liaison person, and not all schools have that. So we're trying to test out, how do you build that capacity within a school, perhaps who don't have that roles within them, and how can we make the most of combining the advice in a school setting. So the next phase includes training for parents to support themselves, so a lot of things that they could do. So again, how they might be able to take forward some of the issues that they have themselves, having second tier training so that the school staff themselves have a bit more idea of what's expected if people are putting forward cases, particularly for citizenship or for lifting the no NRPF restrictions, and trying to build that knowledge within schools. And then where people are coming forward to provide that kind of legal advice, and particularly for casework, so that there's a quicker way of getting to that advice, which often is the case in a community setting. People might know those issues are there, but perhaps don't ask because they don't know where, you know, I'm talking about staff now, don't know where to get the advice instantly. So I think the combination of having training the staff, having the parents themselves, creating a safe environment for people to come forward, as well as being able to provide that legal advice. So there's a lot of learning to take place there, and hopefully we can share more of that. I think my time's up. I didn't quite check when I was starting, but I'm happy to answer any more questions in the chat if anyone's interested, and I'll put my email in there. And I think I'm handing over to Stuart.
Hi there, I'm Stuart Duffin, and I'm chairman of the Scottish Union of Supported Employment. But I'm also going to talk to you today about another couple of hats that I've got on as well. I'm also a member of the Law Society of Scotland's Civil Legal Aid Quality Assurance Committee, which is a joint committee between the legal profession and the Scottish Legal Aid Board. And I'm also a member of the Legal Services Regulation Reform Consultative Group. So I'm going to talk about outline of things of how we do different in Scotland, because we do differently in Scotland, and we do support access to justice quite differently. The first thing that I'd like to say is that the first barrier to accessing justice is when you have to think about paying for advice and assistance. And that is the premise of all my representations and work that I've been doing. The Scottish Union of Supported Employment is a public partnership. And it's a public strategic partnership which gives the third sector the opportunity to design future public services by trying and piloting new ideas. And SUS are trying and piloting and have co-designed support services for employment for people with a disability. And this includes enabling people with disability to access employment rights and actually secure those employment rights and maintain them. As we've seen with the pandemic, and actually at the beginning of a post-pandemic, these rights are not being enabled and asserted, and we're seeing people with disabilities losing their jobs. So what we've done is we've created an approach that's inclusive, supportive and challenging. And we're looking at doing this through the Equality Act, Scotland 2010, similar to the England and Wales Equality Act, but also using other legislation, particularly around Children and Young People Act, Welfare Funds Act, Education Scotland Act, Carers Scotland Act. And just for people, I'll copy this presentation into the chat after I've done it. So looking at how we use alternative legislation in order to secure the rights for disabled people. And what that means is that we have, in Scotland, we have a different legal aid system from England and Wales, in that we have the Scottish Legal Aid Board are funded to deliver services that enable people to enforce and protect their rights, defend themselves and manage their personal affairs and relationships. And legal aid in Scotland isn't limited. So there, in any particular matter, if you go through the means test, you can assure representation from a solicitor who delivers legal aid. Now, in order to deliver legal aid, the legal aid solicitor has to go through the quality assurance process of the Law Society of Scotland. They have to train and they have to register, and then each solicitor is reviewed on a cycle of 5 years. So there's an element there whereby we're assuring that quality is being carried out, we're assuring that customers, our clients, are the focus of that legal aid process, and also that access is not limited, is as unlimited. So it's a different process in England, but it's ensuring access to justice for all. So what that works involves is that it's fairly it's open access, and where there are legal advice deserts, there's actually, in the Scottish Legal Aid Board, have set up civil legal assistance offices. So therefore, if they're particularly in the north of Scotland, where there is a sort of a dearth of legal aid solicitors, there's civil legal assistance offices. So therefore, that also encourages access to justice. But also looking at new solicitors coming in to the profession. This year, the Scottish Government fully funded 40 legal aid traineeships across the country, with particular reference to traineeships in rural areas and areas where legal aid were limited. And that that enabled to try and get a greater spread, a greater geographic spread in terms of legal aid. And I think that, that's a different type of initiative that we're seeing in England and Wales, and it's a different strategy to promote access to justice. So I've put in my presentation some guidance around what the legal aid system and how it works in Scotland, because I think it's a useful comparator and seeing how by not having that barrier of finance, then access to justice becomes much more appealing. And also, in that sense, we do not have to develop and evolve pro bono services as much as elsewhere in the UK. So where does that bring us in terms of working with communities? Well, the justice system is fairly exciting at the moment in Scotland. There's lots of challenges going on. There's lots of challenges between, the Scottish government and and Westminster in terms of integrating human rights, Children's Rights Acts into Scottish legislation, and hopefully we will be successful in winning that debate. But it's an exciting time because COVID has really highlighted how improving access to justice means providing better information advice, giving people more option to resolve disputes without going to court, and having a flourishing community legal services market. And in that process, that's what the review of regulation is about. We're looking at how regulation, particularly for law centres, which is fairly onerous. Law centres in Scotland have the same process, slightly different in that any charity setting up a community law service has to be a charity, but they also have to have an LLP within that, and that causes quite a number of challenges, and it's a burden in terms of regulation. So we're looking at how we change that. We're also looking at how the Scottish Legal Aid Board, and I've been successful in securing funding from the Scottish Legal Aid Board to look at housing debt. The Scottish Legal Aid Board have funded a housing solicitor, a lay representative, and triage people to look at housing debt so that we can actually really focus on a particular element that actually enables people to move forward. And I'll stop there. And I shall put my presentation in the chat, and happy to answer any questions at a later date. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stuart, and thanks to Lizzie and Seaned for speaking on your programmes so eloquently. Also in the chat there are further information on all of those 3 presentations we've heard, and emails as well if you need to follow up on anything. And I'll hand over to Martha, that's going to lead into our next session.
Thanks so much, Stacey. So our second session focuses on what role networks and infrastructure initiatives play in facilitating and supporting work with communities. From our point of view, we've seen a huge growth in the number of community and grassroots initiatives seeking out and signing up for the Network for Justice. And these types of initiatives now form just under 10% of our kind of 870 odd membership. So we're keen to ensure that we're helping them to find the right resources and partners that they need to support their users, and that we continue to build a community around justice that these initiatives feel part of. And I know we're welcoming a couple of those groups here today as well, so it's great to have you with us. But now I'm really pleased to welcome Janet and George, who will be speaking about the Coordinated Community Support Project, their work on improving access to crisis support and how this links into advice organisations, which is really very exciting. So over to you.
Glad to be here. I'm Janet Grauberg, and my colleague George is also here. I'm going to share a very quick presentation. I'll load it in the chat afterwards. 6 slides. So the Coordinated Community Support Programme, it's a programme funded by a number of different funders, led by the Children's Society in delivery, and it's about responding to people in financial crisis, and all sorts of responses across the voluntary and community sector. So it brings together local welfare assistance schemes where they're being run by the local authority, and advice or organisations such as represented here, but also all sorts of other support networks, furniture suppliers, clothing suppliers, in the voluntary and community sector. And it runs in 4 pilot areas, 3 in England and 1 in Wales. And we conceptualize the programme in these 3 ways. We're funding work in 4 pilot areas to improve awareness of, access to, and the coordination of crisis support at a local level across that local authority. That's tier 1. Tier 2, we're promoting the importance of local welfare assistance as a locally responsive crisis offer, and tier 3, influencing national policy and practice, and in particular working with the local government association and other organisations to make the case that the local welfare assistance run by local authorities is not an adequate substitute for properly funded benefit welfare system, and that both are required. And George and the team have given evidence to select committees and other departments as part of that influencing work. What we've identified as part of the programme, which is now 2 years in, is a number of sets of principles. So this is our conceptualisation of the principles of effective local delivery. Access, by which we mean ensuring the people we're working with have access to the services that they need, advice and support that they need, and the organisations have capacity to respond. Awareness of what individual organisations can give, but also organisations in the network aware of what other services, advice and support might be available that they can refer someone to, and coordination, by which we mean communication and referral between organisations in the network. And the model on there on the right hand side suggests that improving coordination is driving access and awareness, but it's not an end in itself. It's a means to improve that. This second set of principles is our current go at drawing out from the programme principles of effective local coordination, what we've learnt. It starts with a network of people who want to work together to achieve better outcomes, who share an understanding and who are motivated to act and to leave their individual and organisational egos at the door. Supported by a mechanism that facilitates robust referrals, and if anybody wants to talk about the specific mechanism that we're using, George can chip in on that. It's more than just the odd email, and importantly, capacity and legitimacy to lead the network. These are aspects of leadership, engaging organisations, encouraging organisations of all shapes and sizes to join, but also administering the underpinning a referral system. These are the key learnings from the programme so far. Coordination of local services does not create capacity in its own right. Organising the slices better doesn't make the cake bigger. We think there may be it's tempting for funders to think that by bringing people together, each organisation will grow in capacity, but that isn't what we found. We found that coordination, we've seen examples of successful coordination, both from the voluntary sector or the local authority where there's capacity and legitimacy. The priority has to be working on the network, and building a network takes time, years rather than months, and that coordination has a cost. It's a real thing in its own right. If there's a system involved, that has a cost, but someone needs to be responsible for that. I'll stop sharing and ask if George wants to chip in on any aspect.
Yeah, just to, thanks, Janet. Just to sort of add that as Janet said, we're kind of moving into our third year now, and I think that we've made some real headway in the pilot areas. I saw that some colleagues that we're working with are on this call as well. But I think sort of listening to the previous speakers, kind of how this work ties in is that piece around that real grassroots engagement, accessing those agencies that are right at the front end of kind of financial crisis for people. So whether that's emergency food provision and other kind of places where people present is really, really critical, and plugging them into an effective network that that they can see a benefit to is really, really key. But also we're having really positive conversations with social prescribing networks. We've onboarded a load of social prescribers to our Tower Hamlets work, and also with schools as well. So again, sort of speaks to some of the work that Sinead was talking about at TfL around you know, those spaces are where people present because they feel comfortable, they feel warm to them, but they are not necessarily experts, and they certainly don't have lots and lots of time to kind of dig deep into those issues. So providing them with an effective mechanism and way to plug into a coherent network means that those individuals are able to kind of move through various support services to meet their needs often. And I think, you know, in terms of that kind of legal support service, you know, we've got kind of Tower Hamlets advice centres and legal support services on there, and there's a variety of ways that it can be moved through, from kind of generalist advice through to specialist advice through to legal support remedies. Be really, really happy to pick up with anybody who would like to pick up with us after this, and I think that's probably about our time, isn't it?
Thank you both so much. I was really excited about having you guys here because it's so valuable to hear all these learnings from this 3-year project, and they definitely chimed very much with me as well. I know they will with other kind of infrastructure and network and coordinating functions in the room as well. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over now to Victoria Speed, who's going to be talking on the Employment Legal Advice Network's plan around engaging community groups in London.
Hi everyone. It's very strange, I can only see myself, which I'm sure can't be right. I'm going to change that. That would be very weird. Okay, I think I've changed it. Thanks for having me here. My name is Victoria Speed and I'm from the Employment Legal Advice Network. And actually that's one of the projects that's funded by Trust for London. And I started with the project right at the beginning of the pandemic last year, to sort of try and help with the coordination of the Employment Legal Advice Network. And that's kind of been sort of a rolling contract as it's turned out. And I'm still here. And actually what we're finding is there's really good reasons for bringing this particular group of organisations together. I'm sure that most of you will be aware of the sort of precarious position of employment legal advice, but just to sort of summarise, the nature of the organisations that are within our network include law centres, citizens advice, but also lots of community groups, including, for example, domestic workers groups, East European Resources Centre, Work Rights Centre, and also some really small community groups that are doing other work in their communities that are wanting to know more about employment rights. And we think this is really important because obviously some communities are unaware of employment rights that might exist. They might come from different places where they're very poor in their employment rights protections, and they might be employed by people who also share their knowledge or share their lack of knowledge. And also there are obviously literacy issues within some groups and other reasons. So the employment rights sector is really needed. Even where there is information, it's really needed to help improve accessing those rights, and we as a sector come together to do various things. And really we've only got 5 minutes, so unfortunately I can't go into loads of detail, but I did put the link up on the website. But just to summarize some of the reasons why we think it's really important. Number one, it's to improve community knowledge, and we're working with a number of our network members to try to do that. So for example, we've been running webinars with the GLA and we've got members from our network to deliver those presentations on the webinars, and they've gone out through the GLA social media to try to aim to reach people who don't have that knowledge, and we're thinking of different ways that we might be able to do that and different ways we can access that. We've also used some of our members to help us provide materials to do videos and things like that. And then also we are improving collaboration in the sector. So we have a number of our members who've got joint funding projects. And so we're sharing information about how you do that, and how that can benefit both the individuals involved, the organizations involved, but also how that might appeal to the funders. In terms of collaboration also, one of the things that we found quite helpful is because within our, obviously what we're trying to avoid is duplication of effort, which is, I'm sure most of you would agree, really important. And so we've got some organisations that can give advice, but then they're looking elsewhere for different services. So within our network, we have both Advocate, which most of you will know of, but also a mediation project. So there are some ways that people can get further assistance beyond the initial advice. It doesn't always work, obviously, and there are capacity issues that are quite evident, but at least it's something, and we can always try to help get that extra bit of knowledge within our network. And my daughter is banging on the door because she's trying to get in, which is very typical. She's forgotten her keys, so I apologise for that. And then finally, one of the things that we really want to try to do is improve the voice of the sector. So nationally, there is no similar organisation like ELAN. So we are working to try to improve the sort of awareness, really, of how employment rights and the importance of legal employment rights is sometimes being missed. So, for example, we're meeting with various MPs, and we're meeting with the MOJ, and we're meeting with local councils and so on to try to help and to make sure that people get that if you don't get employment rights advice right at the beginning, you can actually end up having further needs that can cost quite a lot of money to any of the central organisations. So I think that that's my summary for now. I'm really sorry that I won't be around later to take any questions on it because I've got to go to another talk. But I'd be really, really happy. There's so many people on here that I've been trying to scribble names down. So I'm hoping, Martha, that you'll be able to share some contacts. I think it'd be really helpful to have a chat with quite a lot of you, actually. So very nice to meet you, and thanks for giving me the time, Martha.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I'm going to pass on to Cozy, who will be speaking on the Liverpool Access to Advice Network and how it operates in and across communities, linking communities to advice in Liverpool.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Martha, for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to keep it really brief because we have so many amazing speakers. It's practically impossible to go into any great detail. I have put the website for the Liverpool Access to Advice Network and my email address in the chat already. Please feel free to circulate that to everybody. And I have already sent the PowerPoint presentation that I'm actually looking at right now, but I think it's quicker not to try and screen share. I've sent that to Martha, so please do circulate the slides to everybody afterwards as well. Well, the Liverpool Access to Advice Network, you're all familiar with 2012 LASPO. It caused a reduction of 75% of legal aid provision. Then we had welfare reforms and austerity policies. People were preventing from accessing justice, and their problems became worse. It's literally what Victoria just finished on, that, you know, if you don't get that early intervention, then later on, further down the line, things are much more costly, much more complex, much more complicated. In 2018, the Equality and Human Rights Commission published a report by the University of Liverpool, the School of Law and Social Justice. In fact, the author, one of the two authors, James Organ, is on the call with us today. The other co-author is Dr. Jennifer Sigafors, and that report on the impact of LASPO made some recommendations to the government. I'll leave it up to your imagination as to whether central government actually acted on any of these recommendations. I have included the link to the report in my slides as well, so you'll get all of that afterwards. Now, in 2020, Liverpool City Council, in its capacity as local government, did actually take those recommendations to heart and funded the Access to Justice project in order to mitigate the worst effects of LASPO and all these other policies. And the network was created as part of that project. And the project aimed to provide a strong evidence base of the social impact of legal aid cuts and welfare reform in Liverpool, and also to gain an understanding of the advice services available to people in Liverpool. Those objectives were achieved through the university. So in the first year of the project, that research was concluded, and we had a mapping exercise, and we have a really good snapshot of what advice looked like at that point in time, because actually things change really quite quickly. And the other two aims were to develop the referral and training capacity for Liverpool's third and advice sector, and to increase access to advice for Liverpool residents. And we were able to secure additional funding for a second year of the project. And that's where I'm at. I'm about halfway through that second year to continue with those aims. So in the first year, we signed up mostly legal advice providers, and now in the second year I'm adding a lot of other support organizations. I was delighted to hear Victoria mention that as well, that there's real merit in putting different types of support organizations and different types of community groups together with legal advice providers to increase access to justice. So on our network, we now have 98 individuals, and they represent 47 organizations, 10 of which give legal advice. I'm thrilled to see that Julie Aylan from the Employment and Equalities Law Centre is on the call today as well. She's one of my members, one of our members on the network. And we have 3 universities, 4 law centres, 6 housing providers, and many advice and support organisations of all sizes. So we have the big players, of course, Citizens Advice Liverpool, who host my post, but also Liverpool Community Advice and Shelter, the Salvation Army, but also really small organisations that are the ones who literally have the clients sitting in front of them needing help, such as the Frontline Polish Church and Thrive Employment Hub and many others. 21 of these organizations are set up on our secure electronic referral system. It's called ReferNet. And on that, there are altogether 45 organizations in the Liverpool City region. So membership of the network doesn't automatically mean membership of ReferNet and vice versa. They're 2 separate networks, if you like, that you can tap into, and ReferNet gives us a really easy way to refer across, and there are some national organizations on there as well. We have monthly meetings and alternate between networking sessions where we give service updates, discuss research and campaigns, make calls for evidence, and information sessions where we share training opportunities and train each other. And we're now moving on into collaborative funding bids, and have just recently made our first ever collective submission of evidence to a parliamentary select committee. And I think that's roughly 5 minutes. I hope I've not gone over. Do please get in touch with me if you want to know more, and it would be really lovely to connect with some of you. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over, I believe, to David Hawkes from Advice UK.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be here and good to see so many people attending this meeting. So I'm going to talk about a project that Advice UK is working on around supporting our members who work with minority, ethnic and other marginalised communities. What in a way we're actually doing is bringing 2 different strands together for one piece of work. So the first strand actually relates to those of our members who work with minority, ethnic and other marginalised communities. I mean, 102 of our 786 members actually specifically work with defined minority ethnic communities. In addition to that, we have many other members who work with other demographic groups, whether that's on the basis of disability or age. Now, we know that the people supported by these members experience disadvantage and discrimination, and we also know, this won't come as a surprise to anybody, that this disadvantage has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So that's about the people served, but we also know that the organisations themselves experience disadvantage, that that they lack the support that they need, and that they're very often quite poorly resourced. So that's kind of one side of the issue. The other issue relates to what we call the whole person, whole community approach. Now, this is something that we've been working on for a number of years. It kick-started well over 10 years ago when we worked with Vanguard Consulting. You may have heard of Professor John Seddon, and explored how the Vanguard method for systems thinking could be applied to the design and delivery of advice services. Now, over the years, that's developed into what we call the whole person, whole community approach. And I think it has come as no surprise to you that, you know, for many organizations, advice has become increasingly atomized, increasingly transactional, and increasingly prescriptive. And perhaps, well, I think more than perhaps, is actually failing to meet the full range of needs of people who are seeking advice. You know, people don't present as a neatly packaged debt problem or an employment problem. You know, the issues that they bring are related to a whole load of other factors in their lives, including benefit entitlement, housing, health, mental health, employment, education. So we think if we really want to drive improved lives for people and better outcomes, then we really need to tackle the whole person rather than, as I've said, in just a purely transactional way. So what we're doing with this piece of work is trying to bring these two things together. We've received funding from the Citybridge Trust for a phase 1 piece of work where we're working with 12 members from London who mostly are working with minority ethnic communities, but also a couple of them are also working with age-related organizations and also disability organizations. And what we're exploring at this phase is how we could apply the whole person, whole community approach to marginalized communities. So that's phase 1. It's a very, very recent work. So I'm afraid I haven't got a massive amount to tell you other than that we've had the initial meeting and we're actually now scoping out, if you like, a proof of concept with the idea that we will then be in a position to apply for phase 2, which will be a much more ambitious, much more comprehensive program of work, and will reach out to more members beyond the initial 12 that we're working with at the moment. And I mean, ultimately, in terms of the aims, it's about strengthening organizations, it's about strengthening communities, it's about improving people's lives, and of course, tackling disadvantage and discrimination. So there we are. I've tried to be really, really pithy. I'll put contact details in the chat if you'd like to contact myself or my colleagues if you'd like to know more, but I will now hand over to Caroline.
Hi everyone, my name is Caroline and I head up the clinics program at LawWorks. LawWorks is an access to justice organization that promotes and facilitates free legal advice for individuals who can't afford to pay for services on the one hand and small not-for-profits. Within the clinics program, we work with third sector organizations, law firms, and law schools to develop free legal advice services across England and Wales. We also provide practical and strategic support to a network of clinics that we call the LawWorks Clinics Network, which is what I'll be speaking about today. Since the first pandemic lockdown, one of the ways that we tried to bring together clinic coordinators and support clinics and was by hosting monthly information exchange sessions, which we call info exchanges. These are an opportunity to share learnings and discuss certain topics and common queries. Often these are centered around best practice and collaborative working with and for the benefit of the communities that these clinics serve. Sessions that have focused on access and establishing networks that we've held, and I'll pop the links in the chat box later on. So we did record all of them, and there's some presentations, but some of those have focused on supporting remote access to advice, how to support harder reach communities, working with the LGBTQ+ community, referrals into, between and out of advice services, and around developing accessible services and addressing digital exclusion. So prior to the pandemic, the large majority of our now over 300 clinics, part of the network, were face-to-face clinics, and we're really operating a face-to-face model for clients to drop in or via appointment. And they're often in the heart of the communities, and this shift of transitioning this in-person legal advice to remote delivery has meant, as many of you know, that clients, well, it has sort of enabled clients to better access advice. There's also a group of clients that is now less able and or less likely to access these clinics. And the challenge now is to ensure that services are reaching these, the disappeared clients, so to say. This is why a few months ago, with clinics on the network, we started discussing how working in partnerships with community-based organizations can help clinics raise their profile and awareness about them, and extend their support to hard-to-reach clients and into the communities. The discussion has really signified the importance of building these connections with other organizations with which clients already have a relationship, and to build on that trust in services that already are at the heart of these communities. We talked about how to build these links and create effective networks around clinic services or advice services, so that clients receive the appropriate support at the right time. And that's something that previous speakers have touched upon, really, is the importance of early advice. Just want to highlight a few numbers from our 2020 clinics report, which is data we collect from the clinics on the network. And from that, we've seen that almost 50% of the clinics saw clients arrive at a later stage in their legal issues. 40% of the clinics reported that the complexity of legal matters had increased. And 40% of the clinics reported that clients presented with multiple problems, as someone before me also highlighted. So some of these really community-based organizations at this time that are useful connections for, I'm sure, many, are community centers that are operating face-to-face or in person right now, food banks, social prescribers, mutual aid organizations, but also faith-based groups, and any sort of trusted in the heart of the community organization. And this is also something that came back to a session that we ran recently around the Windrush scandal, where we heard from clinics working with those affected that the need for collaborative efforts and reaching out into the communities and working with these communities to ensure that you can provide this advice effectively and build trust. And on top of this element of trust is that these links are particularly useful when the client group or community an advice clinic is aiming to serve isn't able to access the service remotely. And that's when it's important to really rely on these frontline organizations that can support clients in accessing the service and sitting with them or working with them to enable that access and to support that access. So that's something that's all sort of discussed in the links that I will share and will hopefully be useful to some of you. And there's some clinics I've seen, our clinic coordinators that are on this call, which is always great to see. Something we discussed as well is advertising your services and how to go about that differently to make sure that you reach into the communities that you are aiming to help and support. And how to build your networks around you to make sure other services are aware of your service and can refer clients to you, and sort of creating those networks. I can keep going on about this, I'm afraid, but my time is up, so I'm going to hand back to Martha, but I'll pop some links in the chat and my details as well. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And thank you to all our amazing speakers for coming up and really kind of livening up at least my Thursday afternoon. You've all been incredibly inspirational and helpful. So a massive silent round of applause to you all at this stage. I'm going to hand over now to Stacey to introduce us to our final session.
Thanks, Martha. So now we're turning to research and what the research tells us about the impact and methods of working with communities and how we can learn from an international perspective. So to start us off, I'd like to share just 2 research project overviews from our colleagues at the Canadian Civil Justice Forum, who support the Access to Justice Research Network. So while there's no published research findings on these projects, we will share those as soon as they're available. So first off, we've got the Community-Based Justice Research Initiative, and this involves partners in Canada, Kenya, Sierra Leone, and South Africa. And they're leading on country case studies to improve understanding of the relative quality, impact, and cost of community-based justice services, and in turn, the appropriate bundle of services to scale. So the case studies themselves, they focus on legal problems with strong gender dimensions, so such as access to justice for spousal and child support cases, property and tenancy disputes. So collectively, these local initiatives will also contribute to developing a broader set of comparative findings and recommendations that can feed into an ongoing global debate on scaling access to justice. And ultimately, the project will aim to catalyse new ways to conduct access to justice research, target key policy openings at the country level to try to steer access to justice priorities and support and build recognition of access to justice as a key priority both internationally and at the country level. So my colleague Tia is going to pop that link into the chat, so thanks very much, Tia. Secondly, the Measuring the Impact of Legal Service Intervention. So quite a mouthful, so we'll just call it Measuring Impact Project. So this seeks to explore the impact of access to legal assistance for people experiencing legal problems. So it's a long-term study in the very beginning stages of data collection, and it will focus on the impacts of access to lawyer support, and then subject to funding, we'll then explore other legal services, information and delivery models. So through this project, researchers will connect with low-income clients who are receiving legal aid assistance through legal clinics in Ontario. Clients will be followed from the start of the resolution process. And I think this is where it gets interesting because we often run out of resources before we can do this. But so the clients will be followed from the very start of the resolution process with a legal clinic until after their problem is resolved. And that will help assess whether access to legal help has had personal health or other impacts on their life. And I think this definitely chimes with the messaging featured in the advice sector submissions to the recent government spending review, which really reflected on the impact of advice on wider outcomes such as health, as well as savings to the public purse. So as soon as we get more details or there's any findings on that, we'll share them with you. And again, Tia is going to share the link to that particular research study. We're also collecting research and reports in this field of work, and you can access that through the G folder that Martha shared in the email, and will also go in the notes. So next off, I'm going to hand over to Sarah Stevens.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Stacey, and thank you for inviting me to present today. So for those of you I haven't met before, I'm Sarah Stevens, and I'm a solicitor and an independent consultant now, formerly a solicitor, I suppose, on a range of access to justice projects in the UK and internationally. I'm also completing a PhD in the role of technology to increase access to justice in low-income countries. And I'm conducting research in Tanzania on that project. And I'm also trustee of the Access to Justice Foundation. So my international experience and research is mainly from working on justice projects in East Africa over the last 20 years. So I'm going to discuss some of the lessons learned from that region, which might help us frame some of the work that we're doing in the UK. So in regards to terminology, I've noticed that there are some key phrases that have been around in the international development sector for a while that are now appearing in the access to justice space in the UK. So phrases such as legal empowerment, people-centred justice, the justice gap, community justice, community paralegals, and grassroots justice providers. And personally, I love these phrases because they remind me of community legal projects that I've worked on in Kenya. But more importantly, I think that cross-fertilizing ideas and best practice from different countries can be really useful. But it is important to remember that some of these terms may mean different things in a different context. So in particular, where there is a different understanding of what justice is and what a model of justice service delivery should look like. So for example, in the UK, we think of legal advice and access to justice as access to lawyers or legally trained individuals or advice centres, and in a more formal setting. And in our population here of 67 million, we have 150,000 lawyers and about as many paralegals. But by contrast, in Tanzania, where I'm currently conducting research on models of justice service delivery, there's a population of 61 million and they have just 10,000 lawyers and 5,000 paralegals. So the question for somewhere like Tanzania is therefore, how do you deliver justice without lawyers? And how do you deliver justice with limited or inaccessible legal infrastructure? So it's too expensive to build up a fully functioning legal service in a country where they don't have lawyers or legally trained professionals. So how do we there help people resolve disputes? And I think that part of the answer to this is really thinking about the end user. What do they need? And how do we develop a system of dispute resolution or access to justice that works better for the end user? Or in sort of development terms, how do we build in people-centred justice? And then this then brings us into the realms of this term legal empowerment, which has now become popular again in this international context and in access to justice dialogue to describe the process through which individuals are able to claim their rights in the formal system. It's this process of giving individuals agency over their justice issue. So much of my community-based legal empowerment work in East Africa has been alongside community paralegals, working with women's groups to understand their priority justice needs and to support them as they navigate a complex pluralist justice system. So that combines customary law, Sharia law and statutory law with both formal and informal dispute resolution. And the biggest challenge for most women actually is the role of these sort of underlying power dynamics that operate as barriers to negotiating justice. And there are often so many social power factors that prevent women from being able to kind of really voice and articulate what their justice needs are. And in this work, we observe this sort of iterative cycle of how increasing access to justice benefits communities, and then also how communities shape and influence the form of justice that's delivered and how those individuals experience justice. So rather than think about how we can equip lawyers and paralegals, the focus shifts to how we can equip and empower the end user. And empowerment tools that we've used take different forms, including community legal education, public awareness campaigns, and increasingly using technology where that's possible. And essentially the approaches and interventions that we're looking at is to help develop legal capability. So that's to help individuals with their issue spotting, knowing if they have a justice issue and recognising that, and then around help seeking, knowing where to go and what to ask, and then help being able to use the tools that we can then give them to use. And then that then sort of takes us on to the issue of how do we know if an intervention that we've introduced has increased access to justice? So that question around how do we measure impact? And again, there's some excellent approaches in the international development space that have been developed through years of running health and education programs that we've kind of been able to piggyback off and apply to evaluating impact in the justice sector. And so, for example, using that legal capability model, we can measure legal capability both before and after an intervention. And then there's a host of other tools and surveys for collecting impact data that we would use. And then so finally, just to wrap up, I just wanted to sort of stress the importance of not forgetting to communicate and share learnings. And we've touched on this before, just earlier, but really to energise public engagement around the value of the work that's being done, the value to society and to the public purse. And I've noticed that lots of international agencies are very good at this, are very good at sort of telling the story. And, you know, we've just heard already on this call about some of the amazing work that's going on in the UK. And I just, yeah, just really feel it's really important that we get better at increasing awareness of the impact that the work we're doing is having on local communities here. So that's a really quick whistle-stop tour, but please do get in touch with me. I'll put my email in the chat if there's anything you want to follow up. I'd love to sort of keep talking about these issues. So now I'm going to hand over to Wendy Eads from Law for Life.
Hello, hi, good to see you all today. My name's Wendy Eads. I'm Research and Evaluation Officer from Law for Life, which is the Public Legal Education Foundation. And it was great to hear from Sarah about public legal education, because I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing here in the UK in terms of trying to measure the impact of access to justice here through some of the interventions we actually do through Law for Life. Basically, we've been, I think my colleague, my CEO, Lisa Wintersteiger, actually mentioned last week, if you were in on the call then, about one of the programs that we've been working on in terms of supporting trusted intermediaries, and about to find more out about basic housing rights so that they can help people in their communities. So it really sort of fits quite well with a lot of the things that we've been talking about today in terms of what we want to sort of try and the work we can do in the communities through trusted intermediaries. The work that we've been doing with communities in this way have been going back several years. We're well known for our advice guides via Advice Now online, but we've also been developing and delivering courses on common legal issues for community workers and volunteers for the last 8 years, particularly in the London area and funded by Trust for London. We've been building up a body of evidence about how these courses actually impact on the knowledge, skills and confidence of the community workers to help them serve those people that they serve to better access their rights, and particularly in the housing sphere. In the last 18 months, we've also been part of the LISLIT project, major project funded by the Ministry of Justice and administered by Access to Justice Foundation. And that's allowed us not only to expand our provision of online advice through the Advice Now guides, but also to fund our research and evaluation and develop that. This is enabling us to try and develop the evaluation of some of our other interventions. So as well as our training courses, we also provide an intervention called Affordable Advice, which is offering a legal advice, unbundled legal advice to people on very low incomes who are seeking to obtain a divorce and going through.
On that one, I completely forgot about you, and I've got another one in 5 minutes.
Okay, don't worry. It's
also, we also provide a very popular automated letter service to help those who are challenging DWP decisions on their PIP and DLA applications. But we wanted to look at some of the bigger questions, how we can support legal capability. And Sarah mentioned about some of these fundamental questions about not trying to help support people to support themselves or find information themselves where they haven't got access to legal advice through lawyers or through law centres or other legal advice centres. In terms of helping them develop their knowledge and understanding of legal issues, you know, when they need to seek help, where to find that information, what they can do to take action, and their confidence to actually put that into practice. So we're looking at lots of different research methodologies to try and get closer to some of these big questions. So I'm going to focus on the same project that Lisa mentioned last week, which is, just very briefly for those who weren't in on the call, between February and March this year, the Ministry of Justice actually directly funded 2 short courses of 3 interactive online modules on the housing rights of women to attendees from 44 frontline organisations in the southwest and the northwest England. Now, both of these regions are characterised by a severe shortage of social housing and a lack of access to free advice on housing and homelessness law, as any of you who've seen the recent maps published recently about legal deserts will attest. We had 49 participants overall, and we include a whole range of people. So people from women's shelters, from food banks, volunteers from food banks, drug and alcohol support workers, NHS link workers and NHS social prescribers. And we actually attracted a high proportion of social prescribers, which is a first for us. And we've been actually looking at how we can perhaps work with that particular group of trusted intermediaries who can actually perhaps reach into those parts of the communities that we haven't been able to access, we haven't been able to get the message across to before. And they were potentially offering an alternative route to advice and support on housing issues, other than the community workers that we've provided training to before. We were also able to sort of look at some of the barriers that people were finding in accessing that advice, particularly in the housing sector. We tried to understand a bit more about the barriers also provided by COVID-19. The courses we used to run in London used to be provided face-to-face, but we've since been able to actually move these online, which has brought both benefits and some challenges as well. I think the biggest innovation in our research has been able to test how people's knowledge is improved, knowledge of legal issues has improved, and do it objectively. So we actually test, a bit like Sarah was suggesting, we test this through asking attendees questions about the specific aspects of housing rights covered on the course, before and after the course via online surveys, and then we analyse the difference. And we also ask about their confidence, how they feel their confidence has changed in dealing with specific issues, such as the Section 21 evictions or disrepairs before and after the course as well. But the major thing that's a big innovation for us is we followed this up with semi-structured interviews of some of the attendees 3 months after the course has ended, asking them how they've been able to apply their knowledge and the confidence they've gained. This enables us to sort of triangulate this objective testing and give us a much more accurate picture of the short and medium term impact of our work. The online surveys suggested mixed results on the increase of knowledge. A lot of that was because people already had good prior knowledge on particular aspects because they'd been working in that area, but also level of complexity of how the law was implemented. So, you know, there'd been a lot of changes, particularly with COVID, but even without COVID, there'd been a lot of changes to housing law in the last 18 months to 2 years. Overall, the courses achieve sort of substantial changes in the confidence of participants to help people with housing issues. Participants in the southwest of the country who came to the courses actually report an increase of 75% in confidence, and the northwest participants report an increase of 89% on average. One of the examples I did when I was actually doing the interviews, one of the people I spoke to said, before the course, I dreaded when people asked me about housing issues, but now I'm much more confident and I'll actually ask them about their housing issues. That proactiveness is a really good example of how we can change people's confidence in dealing with these issues, and hopefully that will enable people to get better outcomes, the people they're helping better outcomes. Certainly, we're looking at how we can develop this still further. It's a movement on from, we want to look at outputs, but it's a movement on from that into outcomes, and looking at, we can get some of the data that we need in terms of numbers through technological means and technological tools. But we really want to look at more qualitative methods as well in the future to find out what impact our service makes on communities, using interviews, but also looking at more participatory and action research methods, which enables the people, our end users, if you like, to be involved in designing the research and deciding which issues are important to them. And that's particularly important in developing our understanding and to how we develop our future interventions, and not just in terms of the training courses, but also in terms of the other things that we can do to help people, whether that's online or through people in the communities. Either way, we're trying to we're trying to address this early intervention issue as far as is possible and get the word out about what is available for them and how we can signpost and support them in the legal issues that they need help with. I think I'm probably got near to the end of my time here, Martha, I think. So I think I'm going to pass on to Lindsay Poole from Advice Services Alliance for the final presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Wendy, for that run through, and very interested to hear about the work that you're doing. I have some slides. I don't know, are you going to be able to put those up for me?
Yes, I will.
Martha, lovely. Yes. Thank you very much. I've been knocking around the sector now for quite a long time, really, and one of the things that always occurs to me is how useful it is to actually kind of look back over things that have happened in the past, and also to share things that are happening in different places. So if we can just quickly move on. So this is some of the lovely images from the advice sector in the past. So you can see a clip from Cathy Come Home, the welfare bus there in the middle from Citizens Advice, Toynbee Hall there, that's generally thought to be the earliest example of an advice organisation. And it's just to say, you know, we have done this stuff before. The advice sector has worked very closely with communities, and we need to remember that we have a very long and strong history of engaging with other partners as well. Somebody reminded me recently of the unemployed workers centres that some of whom are still working and you know, are still operating. So we do have examples out there that we can draw on. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is 3 pieces of work that we're involved with in the Advice Services Alliance. Oh, sorry, there we are. Not. Do you want to just skip back again, Martha? Sorry, I've forgotten about this particular slide, which is this is a different sort of way of working with communities. This is a Facebook page that's called Universal Credit Survival. And I dip into this every now and again. It's very depressing to have a look at it, but it does give you a really strong idea of the sorts of issues that people are facing, and how important it is to think about different ways of actually accessing people. Sorry, if you could move on now, thank you. So there's 3 pieces of work that we're involved with at the moment which have very strong community themes. A couple of years ago we did a piece of work funded by the Greater London Authority looking at advice across London, trying to map out what advice provision is there and whether that matches with the community need. And what came out of that piece of work was a very clear understanding that there are far more organisations giving advice than we would think of as being kind of part of the formal advice network. And many of those are indeed faith-based communities or community-based organisations or cultural organisations. And the importance of these kind of community-linked organisations is really important, and that we need to remember that they're there. As a result of that, working with Trust for London, we have starting to set up a Black and ethnic minority advice network across London, and this very much complements the work that David has mentioned that Advice UK are doing. So it's trying to identify a broad network of Black and ethnic minority organisations who can come together as a community of practice to start to look at issues, common themes, but also to look at representation within this kind of strategic meetings such as this, where the Black and ethnic minority voice is often not heard. That project started a few months ago, and if you would be interested in finding out more about that, please do contact me. The second piece of work is actually being funded and led by the London Legal Support Trust, and this is looking at some of the advice skills gap that we've identified. I'm sure everybody on this call is very aware of the fact that there are shortages of legal skills in particular areas of law, but we've also been experiencing quite a number of problems in getting people with supervision experience, with casework skills within the advice sector. And so we're taking a sort of more in-depth dip into what the problems are around this skills gap. And inevitably this has started to touch on issues that we've already talked about today. So how can we skill communities up in order to be able to help themselves? We've received the interim report, and hopefully the full report will be with you very soon. The last piece of work that I wanted to talk about with a community theme is, it's a bit cheeky this, because it's actually only a research proposal at the moment, but working with some colleagues who are here on the call today, putting together a research proposal on looking at understanding communities, understanding their problem-solving strategies, so that we can understand how people who very often are the ones who don't get advice, how we can pivot round to better fit with what people's problem-solving strategies are. This will be based on, if we're successful in getting the funding, it will be based on 3 communities, one in Wales, one in the Southwest, and one in London. And it will be very much looking at getting interviews with people in communities to understand when they have problems, how do they go about resolving them, and where does the advice sector fit in with those strategies. So that's really all I wanted to say at the moment, but just to remind people that we do have a meeting where we bring together the research community on an annual basis, as it's turned out, and that our next meeting, we call it the SCARE meeting, but because everybody should be afraid of research, but the SCARE meeting will be happening on the 26th of November, which is a week tomorrow. And again, if you're interested, then please do get in touch with me. Finally, I just wanted to say, I'm just going to post in the chat some different definitions that there are of communities, because I think we do often talk about communities as if they are a thing that you can see, but I think we need to remember they're very amorphous and that people come together for very different reasons, and this is a definition that I found very helpful. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thank you to all our speakers for this last session. Always with Network for Justice events, I feel like I then need an hour to kind of re-watch everything and just digest, because there's so much packed in. So thank you so much, Martha, for leading on the organisation of today. I'm afraid that we've run out of time for questions, but the chat has been very busy, so I hope you found that productive. And also, you know, everyone has their email address there, or Martha can pass those on to you. But I'll, if I can just pass on my own thanks, and then I'll let Martha wrap up and outline some next steps.
Thank you so much, Stacey, and everyone. Thank you so much for staying until 5:30 on a Thursday evening. I really appreciate the dedication of everyone. Thank you so much to our amazing contributors who have been really inspiring and really concise as well. I do feel like we've run a bit of a marathon, but as I said at the top of the meeting, this is really just to give that impression of how much work is going on and give a little bit of insight into every different area. Thank you to all of the attendees as well for taking the time to share your learnings, experiences via the chat function. A lot of people have been asking, yes, we absolutely share everything from the chat in the meeting notes, and we'll be doing a video as well. So don't worry, you'll have access to everything that's been shared here today. As part of our follow-up, we'll also be collating some case studies and examples. We're going to be collating the research mentioned here today, as well as some key learnings and insights from that as well. So that will be available. And we'll also be asking for feedback from you guys on what we should be doing in the space next, whether it was useful just to hold a space for us to have a discussion about it, whether you'd like to learn more about particular things, or whether there's anything else that we could be doing to progress work in this area. But that is everything. Thank you so much again to you all for attending and coming today and sharing. It's been brilliant to hear about so much amazing work that's happening, and I look forward to being in touch later as well. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy your evening.